Hey, this is Brett, and you're watching Brett and Some Books. Today we are continuing The First Casualty by Philip Knightley. This is Chapter 12, Remember Pearl Harbor, 1937 to 1945. Please hit the like and subscribe, and I will bring you more history and other books and reading. Also, this one is like a 31 page chapter, so it might be chopped up into like 4 pieces. I'm not sure. And beginning. In this nation of ours, the final political decisions rest with the people, and the people, so that they may make up their minds, must be given the facts, even in time of war, or perhaps especially in time of war. Paul Scott Maurer, editor of the Chicago Daily News and one-time war correspondent. I wouldn't tell the people anything until the war is over, and then I'd tell them who won. Military censor at a meeting in Washington. Japan had been on the offensive in China since 1931, and that year she had invaded Manchuria and had cut off 3 northeastern provinces from the rest of the country. In 1937, she moved to take over the 5 northern provinces, but China resisted, and soon the war spread over the length and breadth of the country. For war correspondents, it was a brief return to the Golden Age. The war was ruthless, bloody, and dramatic, and yet, for the British and American correspondents, comparatively easy to cover, with the expense no object. Once again, correspondents set out from London with gold sovereigns and money belts, but this time on chartered flights, London to Shanghai via Singapore, £3,000. The headlines were worth it. "Canton bombed. People go mad with terror," said the London Evening News, September 23, 1937. "The most terrible air raid in history took place today. The majority of bombs fell in densely packed dwelling areas of the poorer classes, reducing buildings to dust and their occupants to mincemeat," wrote Reuters correspondent Jeffrey Emerson. "Corpses are as thick as flies on paper in the summertime. Limbs and mutilated bodies are piled high in utter confusion. It is as if gigantic, ghastly abattoirs had been created." British and American newspapers clamored for eyewitness descriptions like this. It was all far away from London and New York, and Herbert Matthews's long arm of war had not yet reached out to the strollers along the great white way of peaceful America. The news in China was there for the writing. Bombing raids, the greatest the world has ever known, attacks on British and American gunboats, poison gas. Green clouds hang over the front, and in October 1937, the Battle of Shanghai, the world's greatest drama, recalled to many even today by the photograph of a Chinese baby sitting in the bombed-out ruins of the railway station. There were 2 cities in Shanghai, Greater Shanghai and the European-dominated international settlement. While nearly 1 million Japanese and Chinese fought in Greater Shanghai, the war correspondents had a ringside seat in the international settlement. It was, wrote Edgar Snow, the American correspondent working then for the London Daily Herald, as though Verdun had happened in the sign in the full view of right bank Paris that was neutral, as though Gettysburg were fought in Harlem while the rest of Manhattan remained a non-belligerent observer. In the mornings, the correspondents would go out behind the Chinese lines in their cars. The thrifty Swedish correspondent, Eric Nystrom, took a bus. They would return to the settlement in time for lunch, drive down to the Japanese front in the afternoon, and rush back for the evening Chinese and Japanese press conferences, write their copy before dinner, and dispatch it through the settlement telegraph office, certain that it would reach London or New York in a matter of hours. For a break in this routine, they could sit in the Park Hotel, drinks in hand, and watch the Japanese dive bombers, or go up on the roofs of apartment blocks and see Japanese gun batteries in action. It was not entirely without risk, and on November 11th, the last day of the Chinese stand, Pembroke Stevens, the Daily Telegraph man, who had survived the Spanish Civil War, was shot in the head and the groin in the last hour of the battle and died instantly. O.D. Gallagher wrote the story for the Daily Express and sent it to Stevens' own paper. Quote, "I couldn't scoop him on his own obituary," end quote. It all happened at such close quarters that a film cameraman who captured the whole action found that the screen, it looked like a Hollywood movie. Another correspondent, an Italian fascist, Sandri, was killed when the Japanese dive bombers sank the American gunboat Panay in the river Yangtze. Luigi Barzini wrote the story for the Corriere della Sera. Sandri was lying on the ground with his jacket open and his shirt lifted away from the wounds. There were 2 red holes, but they did not bleed. He said to me, "They've killed me this time. What an end! In another nation's ship, in this country." Barzini's story was given prominence in Italy, and the angry editor of La Stampa of Turin cabled his correspondent, Sandro Volta, "Sandri dead, Barzini magnificent, where were you?" A cry echoed by many editors later in the war. With eyewitness and personal exploit stories at a premium, only one correspondent looked beyond the immediate story to what was really happening in China, Edgar Snow. Snow had arrived in China in 1928, and in his long spell there, he worked at various times for the China Weekly Review, the Chicago Tribune, the New York Herald Tribune, and the Saturday Evening Post, and the London Daily Herald. He was the first foreign correspondent to make a trip to Red Army headquarters, where he met Mao Zedong and Chu Enlai, personal contacts that lasted until Snow's death in 1972. His account of the meeting, printed in the China Weekly Review and then widely reprinted, gave the world the first news of the Long March and the first idea of communist leaders, their life, and their intentions. Snow saw the hypocrisy of the British and American expressions of sympathy at what was occurring in China. Although newspapers gave prominence to the Japanese aggression, they did not write that the United States was the main supplier of war materials to Japan until as late as July 1939. They did not mention the British companies that had contracts to supply the Japanese in China, or the common British view that Chinese resistance was delaying a restoration of trade in the area. Snow saw through Chiang Kai-shek's publicity, arranged for him by Hollington K. Tong, a graduate of Columbia School of Journalism, to the corruption and brutality of the nationalist regime, and he documented Chiang's ruthless suppression of Chinese trade unions. He even saw beyond the immediate horror of the rape of Nanking, when 300,000 Chinese civilians were murdered by Japanese soldiers in an orgy of rape and plunder, to the fact that this would lessen political antagonisms between the various Chinese groups and intensify the opposition to Japan. "You cannot disembowel men at one end of the town," he wrote, while preaching Pan-Asianism at the other. While the war in China puzzled other correspondents, accustomed to war in the West terms of seeking a quick decision, Snow saw that the very flexibility of the Chinese communist resistance, its lack of a visible strategy, would turn out to be its strength. He warned that Japan's advance through China would bring her to the doors of the Western colonies, and of the threat of war that would involve, and before Pearl Harbor, he warned that the United States would sooner or later have to decide on its war aims. Did it plan to line up with its allies' concepts of empire, or was it to fight for democracy for everyone? When the war broke out in Europe, It was doubtful whether the United States would fight at all. There was strong resistance to sending American soldiers overseas again, and even if this feeling changed, the United States Army was in no state to go, ranking only 19th among the world's armed forces, after Portugal, but barely ahead of Bulgaria. Furious efforts to improve the country's defense capacity began. Japan was seen as the major danger, but was seriously underrated. General George C. Marshall, Chief Staff of the United States Army, told the 7 correspondents at a secret press conference in Washington on November 15, 1941, that if war started, America would be in position to, quote, set the paper cities of Japan on fire, end quote, with massive air raids. Throughout the conference, which for obvious reasons remained unreported until after the war, General Marshall never said once the possibility of a Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. It was, he later testified, quote, the one place we felt reasonably secure. The shock of December 7th can, therefore, be well imagined. When the last Japanese plane roared off, 5 American battleships had been sunk and 3 damaged. 3 cruisers and 3 destroyers badly hit, 200 planes destroyed, and 2,344 men killed. For the loss of only 29 airplanes, Japan had virtually crippled the U.S. Pacific Fleet in a single blow. The American service chiefs immediately decided that news of a disaster of such magnitude would prove unacceptable to the American people, and steps were taken to ensure that they did not learn about it. So effective were these measures that the truth about Pearl Harbor was still being concealed even after the war ended. The cover-up began with an iron curtain of censorship that cut off the United Press office in Honolulu from San Francisco in the middle of its first excited telephone report. So drastic was the suppression of news that nothing further, except official communiques, came out of Pearl Harbor for another 4 days. These claimed that only one old battleship and a destroyer had been sunk, and other ships damaged, and that heavy casualties had been inflicted on the Japanese. It cannot be argued that these lies were necessary to conceal from the Japanese the extent of the disaster they had inflicted on the U.S. Pacific Fleet. The Japanese knew exactly how much damage they had done, and reports in Tokyo newspapers accurately stating the American losses meant that the Americans knew that the Japanese knew. The American censorship was to prevent the American public from learning the gravity of the blow. British readers were even worse served. Early newspaper reports actually gave the impression that Pearl Harbor had been an American victory. Jap plane carrier and 4 U-boats sunk, said a Daily Express headline on December 8th. The main U.S. Pacific Fleet is heavily engaged with the Japanese battle fleet, which includes several carriers just off Pearl Harbor, its Hawaii base. Washington reports late tonight say that 1 Japanese carrier and 4 submarines have already been destroyed by the American forces off of Hawaii. After flying to Hawaii on a tour of inspection, the Secretary of the Navy, Colonel Frank Knox, held a press conference in New York at which, with President Roosevelt's approval, he gave the impression he was revealing the full extent of the American losses at Pearl Harbor. Colonel Knox told correspondents that 1 United States battleship, the Arizona, had been lost and the battleship Oklahoma had capsized but could be righted. This must have made strange reading for anyone actually at Pearl Harbor, who had only to lift his eye from his newspaper to see 5 United States battleships, the Arizona, the Oklahoma, the California, the Nevada, and the West Virginia, resting on the bottom. Colonel Knox then went on to say that entire balance of the Pacific Fleet, quote, with its aircraft carriers, heavy cruisers, light cruisers, destroyers, and submarines, is uninjured and is all at sea seeking contact with the enemy." End quote. This list did not mention battleships. Because of the 9 in the Pacific Fleet, 5 had been sunk and 3 damaged. 1 was in a Navy shipyard unready for sea. 3 battleships from the Atlantic, the New Mexico, the Mississippi, and the Idaho, were still en route to the Pacific Fleet. But when one correspondent asked whether the fleet seeking contact with the Japanese also included battleships, General Knox answered that it did. No one embarrassed Colonel Knox by asking which battleships, and American newspapers allowed Knox's figures to pass unchallenged. In Britain, the Times greeted this exercise in deception with warm applause. The full disclosure of losses made by the Secretary of the Navy had a wholly steadying effect. Americans are no more afraid of the truth than Britons, and as free men they have the right to know it, secure in their confidence that they are not to be stampeded either by triumph or disaster. It is only tyrants who must keep their people in the dark. A year later, on the anniversary of the attack, the United States Navy felt it could be somewhat more honest and issued new loss figures. It now said that 5 battleships had been sunk or damaged, but this still evaded the issue because it gave no breakdown of the figures, and the public was still in the dark as to how many of the 5 had been sunk and how many only damaged. The evasion continued even after the war. In 1945, the semi-official War in Outline, published by the Infantry Journal for members of the United States Armed Forces, perpetuated the legend that the only battleship sunk at Pearl Harbor was the Arizona. And as late as 1966, the reports of General MacArthur used the confusing, quote, "sunk or damaged," end quote, formula, with the figure now increased to 8. News of America's killing in 1943 of Admiral Isikoru Yamamoto, the man who had planned the Pearl Harbor attack, was suppressed until after the war. The United States had cracked the Japanese code and learned Yamamoto's exact itinerary. Colonel Knox signaled a fighter ship at Guadalcanal, ordering it to kill Yamamoto and adding, "President attaches extreme importance to this operation." The American fighters caught Yamamoto's bomber near Bougainville on the morning of April 18th and shot it down in flames. It then became imperative that nothing about the attack be published because it could reveal to the Japanese that the United States had broken their codes. Several correspondents heard of the story, but each time the censor stepped in and nothing was published or broadcast until the war was over. American POWs had been freed and censorship had ended, by which time it was no longer real news. The way the disaster at Pearl Harbor was concealed was only the beginning, for suddenly Japan appeared to be unstoppable. Singapore, Hong Kong, Manila, Borneo, New Guinea, Java. By May 6, 1942, the last Americans in the Philippines had surrendered at Corregidor. By May 15th, the British had been run out of Burma. In 5.5 months, the Japanese had seized the richest colonial area in the world, snuffing out in the process the British, French, and Dutch empires. In the long struggle ahead to defeat Japan, the main purpose of news would be to render the greatest possible aid to the American war effort. Truth and objectivity would have to yield to wholehearted patriotic participation in the conflict. "War touches every individual," one American censor wrote, "and no one can remain aloof as a more or less interested spectator. Newspapers and broadcasting stations must be actively behind the war effort as merchants or manufacturers." To achieve this, a huge apparatus was created to control what Americans could know about the war. In the First World War, The Creel Committee combined the functions of propagandist and censor. The committee originated news favorable to the war effort and blacked out that which was not. But by the Second World War, propaganda had become a much more scientific business, and so Roosevelt decided to keep the two functions separate. The Office of Facts and Figures, and later the innocent-sounding Office of War Information, with a budget for its first year of nearly $40 million, under Elmer Davis, the author, news analyst, and former New York Times journalist, became the medium for publicizing the American war effort at home and abroad. The Office of Censorship, under Byron Price, formerly the executive news editor of the Associated Press, dealt with censorship of all civilian modes of communication, reading millions of letters, checking cables and telegrams, tapping phone calls, vetting films, and ensuring that newspapers and radios followed the code of wartime practices, which the censors compiled and frequently revised. Although the stated task of the Office of Censorship was to keep from the enemy information that might endanger the Allied cause, it tended also to concern itself with morale, and it suppressed private letters that, while containing no military information, painted a gloomy picture of the war. Scenes that showed, quote, labor, class, or other disturbances since 1917, end quote, or that, quote, burlesqued or ridiculed, end quote, the United States forces were not allowed in films that would be shown abroad, and Hollywood representatives of the Office of War Information put pressure on film producers to introduce certain themes in films intended for the home market. For example, the pluralism and patriotic, ethnically identifiable names in fighting units. The fact that it was always the Italian, Polish, Irish American who caught the bullet while the WASP leader survived was Hollywood's own touch. In short, the world was to be given the impression that a just and perfect America was well on the way to swift and total victory, since free speech within the United States was guaranteed under the Constitution. This led to a ludicrous situation. Congressman Melvin Moss was able to declare over a nationwide radio network his belief that America was losing the war in the Pacific. Total censorship was imposed on British correspondents in the United States who tried to cable Moss's views to London. Military censorship worked differently. Within the United States, the Army and the Navy applied censorship at source. That is, they tried to prevent correspondents from learning anything they didn't want them to know. The criterion was, is it a good thing for the Army or the Navy to have information made public? Outside America, control was simpler. Correspondents were not allowed in the theaters of war unless they were accredited, and one of the conditions of accreditation was that the correspondent must sign an agreement to submit all his copy to military or naval censorship. The censors were overworked men in a desperate war. They could not get into trouble by cutting out information, but they could find themselves in a lot of difficulty by letting material pass that should have been censored. The censors were overworked men. They could not... glitching out. They had heard Army and Navy public relations officers warned that they would be judged not on what they got into the papers, but on what they managed to keep out. They were accustomed, as military men, to sending and receiving information in the form of military reports, where such things as shades of meaning and subtle qualifications were to be avoided. Their interests and those of the war correspondents were diametrically opposed. Correspondents seek to tell as much as possible, as soon as possible. The military seeks to tell as little as possible, as late as possible. Since the armed forces and not the correspondents were running the war, censorship was spectacularly successful. As the author and correspondent Fletcher Pratt wrote, The official censors pretty well succeeded in putting over the legend that the war was won without a single mistake by a command consisting exclusively of geniuses. War correspondents went along with the official scheme for reporting the war because they were convinced that it was in the national interest to do so. They saw no sharp line of demarcation between the role of the press in wartime and that of the government, and they became so accustomed to censorship that when it finally ended in 1945, one correspondent was heard to say in some bewilderment, "But where will we go now to get our stories cleared?" There was some heart-searching after the war. John Steinbeck wrote, "We were all part of the war effort. We went along with it, and not only that, we abetted it. Gradually, it became a part of us that the truth about anything was automatically secret, and that to trifle with it was to interfere with the war effort. By this I don't mean that the correspondents were liars. They were not. It is in things that they had not mentioned that the untruth lies. Yes, we wrote only a part of the war, but at the time we believed, fervently believed, that it was the best thing to do. And perhaps that is why, when the war was over, novels and stories by ex-soldiers, like The Naked and the Dead, proved so shocking to a public which had been carefully protected from contact with the crazy, hysterical mess. In no theater of the war was the protection of the American public from reality more complete, and in no theater did it have quite such serious consequences than in China. There, the reporting of the Sino-Japanese War had created a dangerous myth. This was that the Chinese peasant armies, under the control of their beloved leader, Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek, and his wife, the beautiful American-educated Madame Chiang Kai-shek, fought the Japanese to a standstill, and given the American money and military supplies, they could actually defeat them. When the Land-Lease Act in March 1941 brought the aid of every kind pouring into China, Chiang's appetite swelled to the colossal. Few begrudged it. What Madame Chiang Kai-shek wants, she wants for the family of man over the entire earth, wrote Carl Sandburg in the Washington Post. In this emotional climate, it would have needed a war correspondent of remarkable caliber to write the truth, that the Chiang Kai-shek regime was massively corrupt, brutal, and inefficient, that Chiang had no intention of pressing the war against the Japanese, that he was stockpiling American military aid to make his rule safe against insurrection. This was not what America wanted to hear, so instead the correspondent sent war communiques issued by Hollington K. Tong, and those bore more resemblance to fairy tales than to reality. The correspondents went off on tours to so-called battlefields where they were shown stacks of captured Japanese guns and equipment, and they knew all the time, one correspondent proved it by scratching his initials on a helmet, that it was the same equipment moved from place to place, just as the same token group of Japanese prisoners turned up time and time again. They wrote stirring stories about the American Flying Tigers, and their leader, Major General Claire Chennault, later the commander of the 14th Air Force, the advocate of the aeroplane as the definitive weapon, who believed that he could defeat Japan with 100 or so fighters and 50 bombers, who, with the help of his former public relations aide, Joseph Alsop, pressed these amazing views on Washington. They did not write that these opinions brought Chennault into serious conflict with his superior, Jennifer Joseph Stilwell, sent to China to reform the Chinese army and ensure that America's aid was used to best advantage. Nor did they report the bitter breach that grew between Stilwell and Chiang Kai-shek because Stilwell saw Chiang for what he was, an incompetent fascist commander without the wit to act in his own interest. And Chiang knew that Stilwell knew. Yet the New York Times, in an editorial on Stilwell, wrote, From the Generalissimo down, they all seemed to like him. What the correspondents did write from China made Stilwell's job doubly difficult. As he reported to Washington, the correspondent's stories about furious Chinese counterattacks and heavy Japanese losses raised the question, if the Chinese army is so full of fight and so well led, what am I here for? The correspondents could not claim that Chiang's censorship was entirely to blame, since even when outside China, they still did not report the truth, partly because if they were, it would not be allowed back, partly because they figured the truth would help the Japanese, but mainly because of friendship for China. No journalist could visit Chongqing, wrote Vincent Sheehan in 1943, without going into ecstasies over the beauty of Madame Chiang Kai-shek, the heroic determination of her husband, and the prowess of Chinese armies. True, one correspondent did try to shake the United States out of this serious misapprehension and shatter the false image of China's ability to fight. Theodore Wright wrote for Time magazine an outraged eyewitness account of the Honan famine of 1942-43, castigating official stupidity, bungling, corruption, and profiteering, and warning of the people's growing hatred of the regime. Times published White's report on March 22, 1943, cut to 750 words and omitting all his criticism. And the first honest assessment of China's military capacity came not from a war correspondent on the spot, but from the military correspondent of the New York Times, Hanson Baldwin. In the Reader's Digest of 1943, Baldwin said that China was not winning battles but losing them, she had no real army, and Chiang Kai-shek's communiques were almost worthless. It wasn't until 1944 that Americans began to learn just how bad things were in China. In Life, on May 1st, Theodore White wrote that the Chiang Kai-shek regime was a corrupt political clique that combined some of the worst features of Tammany Hall and the Spanish Inquisition. The same month, and again in September, correspondents made the journey to the communist zone of China, drew a comparison with Chongqing, and came back enthusiastic. Fed up with their treatment in Chongqing, realizing now that the Chiang Kai-shek regime was not what they had hoped it would be, they were in the mood to be impressed by the communists, and what they saw at the time was no doubt true. They found troops well clothed and well fed and morale high. Gunther Stein of the Christian Science Monitor wrote that any Allied commander would be proud to command these tough, hardened soldiers. Brooks Atkinson of the New York Times, who went with the September group, described local theatricals and generally optimistic atmosphere. The Times ran his report under the headline, Yinan, a Chinese Wonderland City. Disillusionment with Chiang was complete when, back in Chongqing, the reports were heavily censored and in some cases suppressed. Unfortunately, the truth had come too late when Roosevelt, in an attempt to save the situation, insisted on Chiang's accepting Stilwell as commander of the Chinese armies. Chiang refused and successfully demanded Stilwell's recall. Brooks Atkinson considered this development so important that he decided to return to the United States and fight to get the background of the story published. He smuggled what he had written past a military policeman at the Cairo airport, who had demanded that he submit all his papers to censorship. But in New York, the Times had to take the issue to the President Roosevelt before the internal censor would agree to publication. The story appeared on the front page on October 31st and caused an uproar. Atkinson described Stilwell as the ablest field commander in China since Chinese Gordon, and said that his recall represented the political triumph of a moribund, anti-democratic regime that was unrepresentative of America's Chinese allies. Atkinson's assessment of Stilwell may have been debatable, but his other conclusions were not. Stilwell's sacking was an admission that major American wartime policy had failed. What are we concerned with here is the one reason that this failure was that correspondents did not report what was really happening in China until it was too late. Now, when it was no use, every correspondent or former correspondent in the China theater rushed into print with the stories that he had not written or had not been permitted to write earlier. The Associated Press correspondent, Thorburn Wyant, attempting to explain why the American public had not been able to learn the truth about China before, said it was because Washington had kept on hoping it could clear up the mess. Even now, the whole story was not allowed to emerge. Stilwell was ordered not to talk, and when he finally was permitted to meet the press, a censor sat alongside him and not only decided which questions the general would be allowed to answer, but also ruled that correspondents could not write about those questions he had forbidden.